Hi students, this is your Professor Emilianchuk and welcome to Science in Values, Phil 3260. Today we're going to be going over foundational concepts in science and values. And we're going to be tackling this big question throughout this course, and we're going to kind of look at it today, is how do science and values relate? Right, so I take it that many of you are science majors. That's usually who applies for this class, and so you probably have a good idea of what science is. We'll talk about that a little bit, but we're going to talk more about values today. All right, so to kind of warm up, I want you to think about this. When we talk about science and values in our culture, it's sometimes suggested that science is just all about facts and numbers, right? It deals with the objective facts of reality, while values are these kind of squishy concepts that are relative, to the preferences and tastes of individuals and societies. And these things are often just kind of arbitrary. They're imposed on us by the powerful, whether they're our parents or the government. But honestly, they don't really admit of any right or wrong answer, and so they're just something we kind of have to live with, right? So I want you to think about this. Do you share that assumption? Is that something that you've been taught? Is that something you've been imbibed? And why or why not? Why do you think that? Okay, why do you think that? All right, if you do. Or why don't you think that if you don't? Okay, so that's going to be kind of the first major question I want you to think about. We'll be thinking about that in a reflection portion of the class that you have to write about. All right, so that's one thing, just to get you warmed up. Think about that question. It's also good for me to kind of give you some definitions here, just kind of preliminary ones at least, about what I mean by science. All right, and by science I just mean an empirical inquiry, right, that seeks to produce generalizable knowledge about the world, right? Generalizable knowledge is knowledge that's kind of abstract. We have these set of propositions that are abstract, and they can be filled in and applied to any kind of given case. All right, so you can make a prediction, or you can make a certain kind of claim, you can make a certain kind of explanation, given that you have kind of this abstract principle that has been supported by empirical evidence. Right? And then you can use that sort of proposition to, again, do more and more science. That's generalizable knowledge, right? And it's about the natural world, right? We're interested in the natural world. We're not looking into things that are beyond nature, right? Like heaven or God, angels and demons, those sorts of things, okay? That's usually what's meant there. All right, so that's what I mean by science. All right, and then by values, right, I'm going to just use this very general idea here. Values are something that are desirable or worthy of pursuit. And I think it's worth pausing here just about these two different ideas. What's desirable is different, actually, from what's worthy of pursuit. Okay? So desirability, that has to do with our subjective wanting. Right, so things can be valuable to us insofar as we want them, right? So you might really, really, really want an education at Clemson, right? That's what you want, and so that's desirable, and so that's a kind of value, right? That's going to govern your decision making. There's also different kinds of things like what's worthy of pursuit, right? So maybe like think of just education itself, right? It's worthy of pursuit. And it's more worthy of pursuit than, say, I don't know, a life just kind of eating potato chips and watching The Simpsons. Okay, that would not be worthy of pursuit. That sort of life. Okay, that's not the kind of thing that we would want to teach our children to do. All right, and so this is an idea that's more objective. All right, it's objective. Right, so values can be objective, right? This is one of the things I kind of want to impress upon you, about this impression here, is that it might be misleading. Okay, there's two different kinds of values that we're going to be kind of invoking here. The first kind of value that I think that is scientists, you're probably pretty familiar with, right? These are epistemic values. All right, so things like the truth. So if you're a realist and you really you think science can get at the nature of reality, right? Then you're going to want to be discovering truth, right? You want your scientific inquiry to be guided by truth. That's worthy of pursuit. That's not just desirable, that's worthy of pursuit. Same things with like predictability, explanatory power, right? Now this stuff isn't controversial, right? We kind of want these things to be governing and working in our scientific reasoning. We probably wouldn't even be doing science if we didn't really care that much about these things, all right? You know, I don't know what it is that we'd be doing if we didn't care about this kind of stuff, all right? We're going to be talking about non-epistemic values as well. Okay, so these are very controversial, right? So political values, okay? So we might really care about a free market economy. And you know what? We might think that the climate change issue is interfering with that, and so we might become skeptical of climate change because it interferes with political values, right? That's something that we don't necessarily want to involve with science, okay? That's not a way that we think about scientific reasoning. Same thing with like religious or economic or health-related ideas, right? Or environmental ideas, right? Should these things be governing our decisions in scientific reasoning? And sometimes they do, okay? And it's our job to figure out whether or not they're good, that's good or bad or acceptable. Okay, so I just want to kind of prime the pump a little bit. Now, some of these are just be totally unacceptable. Sometimes it's going to be okay, though. All right? Okay. So how do science and values relate? Well, it's complicated, right? There's your answer. Okay. So what we're going to be exploring in this class are these kinds of questions. All right. We're going to be talking about whether or not scientific reasoning itself, just the whole procedure, you know, following the scientific method, you know, is that a value-free enterprise or not? I mean, you might not think so. I mean, you just follow the method, and you know, you get the evidence that you get, and that's just the way it goes. But you know, science and the method is not deployed in a vacuum. Right? There are goals that scientists and engineers that have beyond just discovery, right? So, you know, the time I'm making this video is in July of 2019. Everybody's talking about the moon landing, okay? And so, you know, there's this grand theme of exploration that they have and they talk about. But honestly, the whole political will to fund NASA and the moon landing had to do with just beating the Russians, okay? And so you might think that goals like that have to do, right? You know, that are motivating the science and the engineers that just go beyond just mere discovery and exploration and explanation. Okay. We might think about what sort of values shape the goals, right? That are just, you know, beyond just the epistemic goals. What sort of values are we talking about? There's different kinds, you know, and especially here in the U.S. You're going to have something like industry-sponsored science, right? So here you have science that's sponsored by an industry. So you can think of a drug company or a tobacco company. Oh boy, think about that, right? And what those goals are, you know, that are shaping the way this is done or influencing the way it's done has to do with profit margin, okay? Now, look, there's a way of being cynical about that, and you could say, well, gosh, no, it's corrupted. Yeah, maybe not necessarily, right? Maybe you can do it well, maybe not though, okay? And that you can imagine why. Perhaps a more noble value that could guide industry-sponsored science is just it's an expression of our autonomy in creating products that will meet market demand and give people what they want, right? And we engage in a kind of free enterprise, which is an expression of economic freedom and our autonomy. And that's something that's a little bit deeper than just, you know, money grubbing. All right, and so you might think that that's really valuable. You know, that if you're a libertarian, this is something that might matter to you, okay? All right, obviously science is done in the public sector. So what I mean by that is that it's funded by public money. It comes from taxpayers and the government. And academics are very interested in getting, like, say, like an NIH grant, right? Bringing in money to your university. So, you know, you probably have some Clemson professors here that are, you know, working on getting grants. And part of their job security is bound up in bringing in money to the university, right? You don't get money from the university to do your science, it turns out. They don't like to do that. The college administrators, they're a pretty stingy bunch, and so they want you to go get the money, right? Make a killing, and bring in some dough, and make the university prestigious and a center of science, and bathed in money, so that you can attract students and other research, build research facilities, build buildings. College administrators love to build buildings. Okay, and so that can be something that's really important, right? In how you shape and choose, what topics you're going to be researching. There's also the incentive to being first, right? You got to be first. Okay, the first person to do this kind of whatever discovery it is that you're working on, right? There's media attention, right? Maybe you get on TV, talk about your research, or NPR covers your story, right? Your research and all this kind of stuff. Honors and awards, right? James Watson, the co-discoverer of the double helix DNA molecule, was very much motivated by winning a Nobel Prize. Right? That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be the best. He wanted to win the prize, right? And he did, right? And he did some good science to get it, right? I mean, so being motivated by this stuff, it can corrupt you, but you also might just end up doing really good science because of it too, right? Getting academic tenure, all right? Your college professors who are not tenured, your junior faculty, are very interested in that, right? And that comes with, getting money, getting grants, getting awards, all that kind of stuff, all right? All right, so those are some answers, right, that have to do with kind of how values are influencing science in the contemporary scene. And then we have the question of, who's going to be affected if these goals are met, right? Who are the various stakeholders? Now, obviously, in the private sector, you have shareholders, okay? So private sectors, especially if you're working for some kind of corporation, right, those are publicly owned, and the people who are investing money into the business are the ones to whom the CEO has a duty to enrich, okay? And so that's what matters, right? Profit margin is supposed to be shared among them. Right? And then there's just the rest of us, right? There's the people who just kind of live in your neighborhood and go to your church or don't go to church, or there's the interests of the environment as well. We have non-human life like animals. What happens to them? And so, we want to ask then, ideally, what values should really shape our goals, right? Especially if they're not epistemic, right? Suppose they're ethical types. Okay, what are those that should shape our goals that will affect stakeholders? Okay, so I want you to think about what are some of the ways that you've seen science and values relate in our culture. Think about that. Think about what's going on. Some of you have already done some research, right? You've been working in a lab, all right, and you've been working with professors. And just what have you seen? How do values that motivate these people shape how they do science, right? Think about that. All right, let's talk about bioethics, all right, and history and theories, all right? So I'm going to go over the bioethics, history, and theories issue to kind of give you a little crash course in moral reasoning and how it works. I think what I find is that a lot of science majors aren't too familiar with this, and so a little crash course doesn't hurt because you'll run into some of this stuff as you work in your labs and you start applying for grants and you start working with institutional review boards. All right, so to kind of just look, whenever you take a class like this that involves values and it's a philosophy class, you have to consider the trolley problem. All right, now you probably have heard of this before. This comes from a website, this picture called Trolley Problem Memes. I suggest checking it out. It's pretty funny. All right, and so the big question is what should be done and why? All right, so here you find yourself in this kind of situation. You got this trolley that's out of control, right? Its brakes have failed and it's moving along, and it's moving along this track here. It's going to hit these 5 people, right, who are tied up. Right, they don't have any kind of death wish. All right, so you see how they're all yelling. They're like, "Hey, save me, save me!" All right, and so, and you don't know anything about them either, right? Their character, the kind of relationships. You don't know if any of these people are, your sons and daughters, or your mom, or your grandma, or somebody, your friends, right? They're anonymous to you. You just know that they want to be saved, and that's really it. Okay, and so you're here with the frowny face, right? You have the opportunity to throw this switch to divert the trolley away from these 5 people, but unfortunately, you see that if you do that, that this one person here who's also tied up, right, and wants to be saved, and of course the same rules apply. We don't know if this is Hitler or somebody like that. Okay, it's just somebody who wants to be saved, and that's all we know. What do you do? Okay, what do you do? All right, what do you do? All right, so that is actually not the trolley problem, right? And I'll explain why I say that, all right? Because whenever we talk about the trolley problem, it gets contrasted, right, with a case like this, all right? A case like this. So let's just examine this case. Here you have a similar situation. The trolley is out of control, okay? It can't be stopped. It's rolling along. It's going to hit these 5 people. You don't know anything about them. And there's this really large man here. He's very, very large, okay? Weighs a good amount. Weighs more than these 5 people put together here. And he's kind of leaning over, checking things out and seeing what's going on. And you're up here and you have the knowledge that if you were to just kind of tip him over the edge and push him, right, he would fall onto the tracks before these 5 people, and his girth would be such that he would absorb the kinetic energy of the trolley, and with an unceremonious whump, he would stop the trolley in its tracks as it collides with him, and you would save the 5 people. Okay? All right, so given these 2 setups, right, what do you do? Right? What do you do? Right? So here's what I want you to understand about this, is that the problem isn't that a grave choice has to be made in either case. Rather, it's to explain your choice if you have conflicting judgments. All right, so here's the thing. They've done psychological studies on this. It's really actually pretty interesting, is that most people divert the trolley to hit the 1, and the reasons given is like, well, more people are going to die here, and so you'll save more life. Okay, and so that's kind of this outcomes-based type of reasoning, right? And you think, all right, yeah, we switch it. Yes, there are people who say, well, I wouldn't do anything. Okay, but those are a minority. Most people, I think it's somewhere around like 92%, divert the trolley. All right, 80 to 90%. I forget now the exact numbers, but they have done studies on this empirically, believe it or not. Okay, down here though, man, it's like 93% of the people, they do not push this poor guy. All right, they do not push. They go, no, that would to involve myself a little too much, right? I would put my hands on him, or I would intend his death in some way, and that would be murder. Some people though, they just think, well, you know what, it's the same problem mathematically, and so they would push it. Okay, but those people are in the minority. All right, most people do not push. Right, so it appears that you have conflicting judgments. It's because up here the outcome seems to determine the choice, whereas down here the outcome does not determine the choice. So what's the deal, right? What explains that, right? And that's the problem. That's the trolley problem. Okay, so I want you to think about that a little bit, what you would do if you were in those situations. We're going to be talking about that in the reflection, okay? And that's going to get us into the issues of moral theory. All right, so what is a moral theory? I know you've heard of a scientific theory before, but there is such a thing as a moral theory, right? And that's just going to be any account that makes sense of the terms right, wrong, good and bad, right? And why the reasons that we would invoke, right, to use those terms, and why they may or may not apply. All right? The account then is going to be able to help us explain what makes a certain action right or wrong, or good or bad. Right? And that's a nice theoretical type of thing that explains something for us. Right? And it also, too, is going to do more than just explain why something is right or wrong. It's also going to provide a method for arriving at right judgments about an action. Right? So that's a nice practical aim. Right, so those are 2 things that we want a moral theory to have, and ideally we'd like a moral theory to help us explain, why we might throw the switch up here, but not push the guy here. Okay, Or, hey, if you're the kind of person who would push and throw the switch, or maybe you're the kind of person who doesn't do anything, give us some explanation for why that is the case. All right, another general feature of moral theory, right, is that there's 3 categories of actions. There's your obligatory actions. These are the kind that you got to do, right? You're supposed to do them, and if you fail to do them, then you have morally failed, right? You've done something that's wrong, all right? And that's, a wrong action, of course, is one that you ought not to do. Then in the middle are the optional actions. These are ones that are permissible, but you're not going to get in any trouble if you don't do them. All right, so sometimes moral theorists like to talk about right actions in terms of encompassing both obligatory actions and optional actions. All right, and so obviously, right, an obligatory action is going to be permissible. Okay, that's a logical truth, but permissible actions aren't necessarily obligatory. But we would want to be doing those sorts of actions and avoiding the wrong actions. Okay? All right, so given that kind of framework, right, if we get into moral theories, there's broadly 3 different kinds, right? And I got these little pictures here to kind of help you remember them. Right, the little smiley face I got here, that has to do with the ethics of the agent, right? And what does it mean to be a good person? Okay, we can all make judgments about who's a good person and who's not, right? We do this all the time, right? There are people who we admire in our lives, and there's people we also find just to be disgraceful, okay? And when we start making those kinds of judgments, we're going to be invoking issues of virtues and vices. So this, you might find an admirable person to be one who is patient, who is courageous, is calm under fire, somebody who can, work through a problem in a way that is responsible and intellectually virtuous. Maybe they're thinking about things in terms of truth and beauty or goodness or whatever it is, right? They're the kind of person you want to be, right? They have character qualities that are good. And then of course there's people that who are just they're liars. They're angry, they're irascible, they can be abusive, right? They have a kind of contempt for others, they don't care about others. Okay, those are things that have to do with the agent. Next, we focus on actions themselves, right? Actions themselves. That's represented by the little arrow here. And these have to do with things like duties and rights, right? So you might have a duty, okay, to turn in your homework on time, all right? So I'm going to be assigning you some work, and you have to do it, okay? You have to do it. You have to turn it in on time, and that's your duty as a student, okay? That's defined by the teacher-student relationship and the terms and conditions I outline in my syllabus, and so you have a duty to do this. You also have a right, okay, to be graded fairly, okay? I'm not just, you know what, I like this. I like the way this person looks better than this other person, and so I'm going to give them an A, and give the other person a C. That would be a rights violation. Okay, as a student, that would not be okay. All right, and so these have to do with actions, and these are things that are right or wrong, whether or not I'm a good person, or whether or not they produce good consequences. All right, so that's what rights and duties are all about. Okay, they kind of stand independently of whether or not you're a good person or you're producing good consequences. And we all like things like rights. We talk about them all the time in our culture. And another thing we talk about a lot is consequences. All right, so if you're the kind of person who would divert the trolley and you would push the poor guy, you're probably what's called a consequentialist, meaning you only care about outcomes, and that's it, right? So, and people who are in the sciences like this area a lot, because science can really help determine, at least empirically, what is a benefit and what's a harm. Maybe you can measure these things, okay? And for you measurers, right, this is something that really matters, all right? And consequences always matter. We should always care about them. But what defines an outcome-based moral theory, like consequentialism, is that it is only the benefits and harms that matters. These things, these rights, they don't really exist. Okay, and the only kind of right you have is a right to have people act for your good, right? To produce good consequences, right? A good person is one who produces good consequences. So you end up kind of explaining everything in terms of this. All right, so that's an outcomes-based, consequentialist-based theory, and so these three kind of compete for different kinds of explanations, right? So here's the thing, like I just said about the trolley problem. If you care about consequences to the exclusion of everything else, then there just is no trolley problem at all. Because the math has it in both cases. You pull and you push, and there's just no difference between doing and allowing harm, which is really kind of interesting. There's no difference between doing and allowing harm, and a lot of people think there is. Right? A lot of people think there is. And if you are the kind of person who cares about rights, and maybe virtues and vices, along with the consequences, well, then you might be willing to pull the lever to minimize harm, but unwilling to push, because to do so would be to violate the fat man's rights, or maybe it'd be something to do something kind of just wicked, right? And it would internally affect your character, right? And so on those sorts of views, there's going to be a difference between doing and allowing harm. All right, so is there a solution to the trolley problem? Well, you can read about it if you'd like in this interesting paper by Philippa Foot. She is a very clever philosopher who is credited with making up the trolley problem in this very famous and somewhat short paper, The Problem of Abortion and the Doctrine of Double Effect. And she spells out the doctrine of double effect, I guess, in this sort of way. And this is what she proposes as being a possible solution to the trolley problem. And she says that, look, an action that brings about at least two effects, one that's good and one that's evil, is okay if and only if the action you're performing is intrinsically permissible apart from its effects. Right, so pulling the lever to divert the trolley from the 5, that's okay. But pushing someone, well, that actually doesn't seem like it's intrinsically permissible. You can't just do that to somebody. You can't just shove people. If they're in your way at Starbucks, you can't just shove people out of the way. That might be a rights violation. Right, the other condition is that bringing about the evil effect is unavoidable. That's something that is the case in the first situation, but not the second. And the evil effect is not part of the means to the good effect. Okay, so look, diverting the trolley to the 1 is not part of the means to achieving the good effect. It just isn't. We don't need that guy there, right? Whereas we do need the big guy in front of the trolley to achieve the good effect. Okay, and so he becomes a means to the good effect, and we end up using him as a means, right? And in both cases, the good effect is proportionate to the evil effect, right? So yes, that's maybe your mathematical or fairness doctrine there. Okay, but that she thinks that look, the problem is that this fails this principle because we end up intending the bad effect in point 3 here. All right, when we shove the guy over the bridge. But we don't do that in the switch scenario. All right. Okay, so the upshot is that intentions matter for duty-based ethics and virtue ethics, but not consequentialist ethics. Looking back at these, all right, there's different ways. We talk about the virtue, we talk about the agent-centered approach, right? There's virtue ethics. We talked about that a little bit. There's also ethics of care. That's really big in feminist ethics. You can read about that in the approach that Glannon was talking about in today's reading. Feminist ethics are all over the place today, especially when we're talking about caring for the vulnerable, right? So the vulnerable is this interesting category that a lot of moral attention to a lot of moral attention is given to. You talk about the marginalized, right? There's supposed to be an ethics of care towards them, right? Duty-based approaches, all right? Rights-based approaches, fairness approaches. Okay, if you're a religious person and you believe in divine commands and that those generate duties in us, right? Then you have kind of an action-based moral theory there, all right? Of course, too, the consequentialist approach, you can be a utilitarian and produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number, or something like that. There's the egoistic approach, right? Some people just like to do what's good for them, right? And that's, other people don't matter. Okay? People reason that way all the time. And there's all these different approaches. And the thing you have to understand here is that these theories are meant to be non-relativistic, right? There's some fact of the matter that determines morality. They're objective. Okay, that's what these theories all purport to do, right? Talk about objective morality a little bit. Okay, we're going to make use of this idea in this class. What this means is that there are moral facts or standards that apply regardless of whether the cultural and situation change. Right, so here's an example. Okay, if the Nazis had won World War II and they had indoctrinated everyone to believe that the final solution to the Jewish question was okay and the right thing to do, it would nonetheless remain the case that what they did was wrong. Okay? Ethical relativism denies that this is the case. All right, so I want to talk about relativism a little bit because a lot of college students believe in it. And it's something we're actually going to reject in this class. We're going to set it aside, and I'm going to give you my arguments for why. All right? Ethical relativism. What is it? Well, it has to do with the fact that ethical standards are relative to some cultural preference or personal preference. Right? And it's often invoked, right, by students. This is an argument I've heard many times since college and since being a college professor, is that it's used to explain things like moral disagreement. So you have really smart people that are good and honest, and they profoundly disagree over a bunch of stuff, right? And to side with one issue over another in these disagreements would be to call in the character and intelligence of the other side, right? These people who are smart and decent, they wouldn't be smart and decent anymore, and that's pretty harsh. We don't want to do that. The people that we disagree with, we can acknowledge that they remain smart and decent. Although today, that is not so popular anymore. It's the way it goes today. But, something's got to explain then how it is that really smart and decent people who profoundly disagree can remain smart and decent, right? Ethical relativism does just this, and so therefore it's true, or probably true. Now, the argument has the most appeal when we're talking about whole cultures and societies. All right, so here's an example that I've heard debated in class before, is that honor killings are morally repugnant to us in the West, but in the Middle East, they're regarded as morally permissible, if not praiseworthy. Okay, now the relativistic thesis allows us not to judge an entire society as morally defective, but also it allows us to retain our sense of disapproval towards such a practice. Right, so it kind of gives us both things. Right. Now, like I said, there's two different kinds of relativism. There's the cultural and the subjective, right? So let's talk about cultural, right? So like I just said, here's a Westerner, honor killings are wrong. Non-Westerner says honor killings are not wrong. And that's a nice contradiction right there, right? That's moral disagreement. But look what the relativistic thesis does. What it ends up doing is it changes the sentences to say, honor killings are wrong for us, that's what the Westerner is saying, and the non-Westerner is saying that honor killings are not wrong for us. Okay? That's what happens under the relativistic thesis. Right, subjective relativism makes things relative to the beliefs and opinions of the individual subject. I get a lot of papers in this class that say, well, to me, or for me, this is the case. All right, and so it's kind of an interesting way of writing, but I reject it, and I'll tell you when I mark up your paper, right? I want you to make claims more like this, right? So this is something a pro-lifer would say: abortion is wrong, and a pro-choicer would say abortion is not wrong. But under the relativistic thesis, where we start relativizing things to individuals and their preferences, the pro-lifer then ends up saying something like this: well, abortion is wrong for me. And the pro-choicer, it says abortion is not wrong for me. Okay, but here's something I want you to notice, is that moral disagreement just totally evaporates, right, in both forms of relativism. Okay, it evaporates. We're no longer disagreeing here. So look at pro-lifer and pro-choicer again. They're not disagreeing. They're just making autobiographical statements about themselves. Right? Those are just claims, and they're not in disagreement anymore. Right? Whereas up here, they are disagreeing. Okay, they're talking about abortion. Whereas down here, they're just talking about themselves. Right? Same thing up here. We're not talking about honor killing anymore. We're talking about us. All right? And those are different claims. Okay, and so here's the implication, is that neither form of relativism explains moral disagreement at all. Because you can't explain something that you eliminate from your inquiry. Right? You just eliminate it. So you're not explaining it at all. Okay? Another implication, too, is that if cultural relativism is true, societies can never be wrong in their fundamental moral commitments. Right? They are, in a word, infallible, which is just totally wrong. Nobody's infallible. Okay? That can also happen personally as well. All right? Another implication is that if cultural relativism is true, someone opposed to the conventional wisdom can never be right. But of course, people like Nelson Mandela, Frederick Douglass, and Susan B. Anthony are considered to be moral heroes because they went against the conventional wisdom. Right? So again, the problem here for this is just really, really bad. How do you make sense of this? Okay. All right. And then what fixes society's standards? Right? They could be based on prejudice, right? Ignorance, superficial thinking, or brainwashing. Right? And those are some serious problems. So those are the reasons we are rejecting moral relativism in this class. If you have a problem with that, you can talk to me and we can figure something out. But that's why we're setting it aside. All right, so finally we come to bioethics. Boy, after 36 minutes here of talking, what are we, why set all this up? Well, it's to kind of explain what's going on in the bioethics movement given all these issues, all right? You have to remember, bioethics is something of a 20th century invention. It coincided with big advances with miracle cures and technology and the protests of patients against paternalistic treatment. All right, so paternalistic treatment, okay, it really is exemplified in unethical experiments on human subjects. Obviously, everybody likes to point to the Nazis on this, all right? I don't know if that's an exemplification of paternalism, to be honest with you. I think they were just being cruel and awful to the Jews, okay? And so, but where there is paternalistic treatment, it happened in things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where researchers from the Public Health Service went into a poor Alabama town, found a very poor black population, about 400 of them. There was 200 who had syphilis, 200 who didn't, right? You can figure out who is the control group. And they said, hey, come to our little clinic. We're going to do blood tests and try to manage your symptoms. And of course, they didn't do any of that, right? They just tracked the history of the disease in their lives. And it's like, hey, we'll measure what's going on in your bad blood. Right? They didn't even tell them that they had syphilis, right? And so these poor people came in droves thinking they were getting free health care. Of course, they were not. They were just being observed. And how did their bodies manage the disease, right? What happened when they died? What did the autopsies look like? And it went on for decades, right? And it was exposed in the 70s. Right, and there was a big public outcry, and of course there were other abuses as well that were documented, especially people being experimented on in insane asylums or in prisons, and it was terrible. And so people ended up rejecting physician paternalism, which is this idea that the doctor knows best, right? And patient compliance is something that comes out of or is understood as having a duty to comply with doctor's orders. Right, so they didn't have to ask you for consent. Right? You just had to do what the doctor told you to do. Okay. There was also the polio vaccine. Here you have a terrible disease that's widespread, and you have this new vaccine that comes along, but there's just not enough of it. And so how do you distribute it? Okay, same thing with dialysis machines, right? You need to, people that are dying of kidney failure need to have their blood scrubbed from toxins. It's in very short supply. They come up with a machine to scrub it. And this is happening in Washington State. There are thousands of people who want to use this, and they can only select, a few scores of people. And so there's this committee, with some ethicists, some preachers, some doctors. I think a housewife was on there, and they went through the applications and figured out, well, who should get it? Who needs it the most? Who's it going to benefit the most? Right? And these are questions about how they get distributed. There's life-sustaining technology and the right to refuse treatment, okay, that comes up. All right, and then in 1979, we see the publication of what's called the Belmont Report. Right, this is something, if you are a researcher who's going to be working in a lab and you're going to be working with human beings and human subjects, you're going to have to get familiar with this. Right, this gives us ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human research subjects. Right, and it's the foundation of all of the regulations that are in place in the U.S. today about how to work with human subjects. Right, so it's a document you'll have to get familiar with someday. Then we see in 1979 the publication of Beecham and Children's book Principles of Biomedical Ethics. You can check out that book. It's still in print. I think it's in its, I don't know, 6th or 7th edition now. It's a very famous text, and it boils morality down to 4 principles. We have all these moral theories, and which one is right, nobody knows, right? But here's like the 4 things that seem to matter to people, right? We want to act out of a principle of beneficence, which is to act for the people's benefit. We want to avoid harm, non-malfeasance, all right? And then we want to respect people's autonomy and their choices. And we want to distribute scarce medical resources in a way that's fair and just, right? Now, these 4 principles, you have to remember, none of these are absolute. They sometimes conflict, okay? Not one of them trumps the other. Right? And so the job of the bioethicist is to balance them against one another. So if a case comes up, what the bioethicist's job is to do is to kind of specify each principle, see how they fit and can be operationalized at the case at hand, and then weigh which one is the most important. Okay, so like when it comes to vaccination, bioethicists are going to think that, well, yeah, you might have the autonomy not to get vaccinated. We understand that. However, in doing so, could harm a lot of people, right? And so what we're going to do is override your autonomy and come up with policies, right, that are going to make you get vaccinated or make it very hard for you to choose not to be vaccinated. Okay. However, when it comes to like the end of life and, the doctors, they want to put you in the ICU and you're like, hey, you know what? That's enough. All right, I think that I've had a good run and I'd like to refuse treatment. Well, there, the bioethicist is going to say that your autonomy matters more than the benefits that the doctors want to give you. Okay? So this becomes a kind of balancing act, and that's what bioethicists purport to do. They purport to be experts in that. Okay? They're not committed, or at least they say they're not committed to any formal theory like consequentialism or deontology or virtue ethics, but they just seek to specify these principles in a given case. So, after 45 minutes of lecturing about all this stuff, the reason I go over this is that all of this is in the background in Glannon's piece when he says at the beginning of it that an action or policy is obligated if it is supported by an ethically decisive reason, meaning that it outweighs any opposing reason. Okay, so what we're doing is we're doing this kind of weighting game, And if we can come up with reasons that are decisive to act in the, to act for benefit or to respect informed choice, right, then that's obligated. Okay? It's prohibited if there's an ethically decisive reason against it, and permitted if there's no ethically decisive reason against it. So here's the big upshot, is that bioethics purports to be objective, to give us facts of the matter about what's right and wrong, without appealing to principles that are absolute. Okay, and this is why it's attractive to public policymakers. Okay? Okay, so that is a lecture. That's a lot, right? I know this is 45 minutes long. I try to make these only a half an hour long, right? But consult this when you're doing your reflections. Ask me any questions that you have via email, and I will talk to you later.